Well, here we are again. You can hear the wind and the birds. We'll have to apologise for them. Now, today I'd like to talk about Facebook. I don't think many people really understand what Facebook is all about. And I think it's become part and parcel of everybody's everyday existence, a little bit like waking up in the morning. Now, Facebook is essentially, well, it is a privately owned corporation. It is privately owned. The nearest thing we have to Facebook in the legacy media is advertising TV, 3 for air, so-called 3 for air TV, which makes its profit from advertisements. The more eyeballs you have on a particular program means the more eyeballs you have on a particular advertisement, which means the more you can charge for that advertisement, the more money the television company makes. But the difference between Facebook and a privately owned television station or a privately owned television corporation is that you can't broadcast in Australia without a licence to the government. And once you receive that license, there are certain rules and regulations which govern how that private organisation is able to function in society. Now, Facebook is totally different. It works on the same model. Facebook is very simple. It's a very simple concept. It revolves around you giving freely your personal information to a privately owned corporation which does not need a license to operate in this country, which does not have any rules regarding its behaviour, but it's the same concept as free-to-air TV. Same concept. It's all about advertising. The more eyeballs on a particular issue, the more advertising, the more revenue for the owners of Facebook. It's a very simple concept. That's why they pay influencers money, because they bring eyeballs to Facebook, which means they can put on advertisements and charge more for those particular advertisements. But the key is that Facebook is totally privately owned, not regulated, and it's almost become indispensable to businesses. Now, regarding the current issue, you need to remember that when you sign up to Facebook, and I've signed up to Facebook, you make an undertaking, and that contract means that all the power lies in the hands of Facebook. You have no power. You don't even have the power to complain, because you are not paying for the service. It's your information which pays for the service, your personal information. Your personal information determines what advertisements can be directed at you. So you are not paying for the service, and unlike an electricity account or a gas account or a rental agreement, you have no rights in law regarding what occurs to you on Facebook. For example, public interest before corporate interests was banned from Facebook 12 months ago, over 12 months ago. We saw it as a badge of honour, the fact that we were banned from Facebook. But the reality is, they can ban anybody they like, anytime they like. There are no consequences, because it is a privately owned organisation which is not regulated by government. So that's the issue. Now, many people are concerned that Facebook has blocked news from its site because of its current dispute with the federal government. Now, you may find this hard to believe, But I'm not particularly interested in that issue, because that issue is very simple, as I've explained before. What we have is large legacy media corporations which are losing advertising revenue to Facebook, who are using Facebook to extend their reach as far as their content is concerned, who are now wanting payment for the use of that content. And with a federal election in the next 12 months coming up, and with the Murdoch empire having such an extreme power over the current government opposition, because it owns 70% of the legacy media, which continues to set the political, social and cultural agenda on a daily basis in this country. What we are seeing is the government doing the work of the private corporations. Instead of the private corporations negotiating directly with Facebook to get a monetary return for their information, they've asked the federal government to pass legislation to force Facebook to pay them for that information. So this is a dispute between the government of the day, which is working hand in glove with the legacy media, which is majority owned by the Murdochs of the world, who want money for their content because their advertising revenue has diminished because of the Facebook business plan, which uses your information to specifically direct advertising that may or may not interest you. As I've said before, there is a bigger fish to fry. See, the government currently, the coalition government and the opposition, is not fighting for us. When the legislation was initially introduced, the Liberal National Party excluded the Australian Broadcasting Corporation from the legislation. It was only after the Greens and crossbenchers and the ALP said they would block the legislation in the Senate that they included the Australian Broadcasting Corporation in the legislation, because this legislation is specifically orientated to raise funds for Murdoch and other privately owned media corporations. That's what it's designed for. Now, I'm interested in something bigger than that. Firstly, I'm interested in the concept that Facebook has been able to enrich itself and its shareholders and its owners by promoting misogynist, racist views on their platforms. They have single-handedly been responsible for the rise of right-wing extremism, not just in the United States of America, but around the world. And they've done this for one reason, not because they agree with what's been spoken, but because that type of information on Facebook draws eyeballs to the platform, which means more advertising revenue for shareholders. So that's one thing. They have made their fortune by monetarising misogyny, racism, division. The second thing I'm very concerned about, which the federal government isn't tackling and which they should tackle, is the question of taxation revenue. Now, Facebook makes billions of dollars of profits from the millions of Australians who are on Facebook, who use the platform for their personal lives or their business, but pays ultimately no taxation. A few years ago, Facebook paid, although it had a turnover of tens of billions of dollars in this country and made billions of dollars of profits, it paid less tax than somebody earning $120,000, which is extraordinary. So the federal government, is beating itself on the breast and saying what a great government we are standing up to the bullies at Facebook. They're not standing up to the bullies at Facebook for you, or the Australian taxpayer, or the Australian citizen. They are standing up to the bullies on Facebook because the Murdoch empire and the other privately owned media corporations have a knife in their ribs, tickling them and saying that if you don't do this for us, there's going to be consequences for you at the next election, because it means you cannot rely on our fulsome support at the next election. It's not just the question about Facebook is a question of one of regulation and two of taxation. Every other corporation and business in this country, irrespective of how creative their accountants are, is forced to pay taxes. But these large corporations like Google and Facebook pay voluntary taxation because of the business model they use, where they base their business in tax-free havens. And normal taxation mechanisms do not work in regard to these companies, to these virtual platforms. So what we should be looking at and pushing the federal government to do, and the opposition, is not just using Parliament and the laws to gain money for Murdoch and the other privately owned media empires, but to actually use the law to ensure that Facebook and Google, like the rest of us, are forced to pay reasonable taxation for the good of the citizens and residents in this country. I mean, that's the reality. So how would you go about this? One way is through a 1% transaction tax. Income tax does not work with these corporations because they can move their headquarters to tax-free havens. They can use loopholes in the law and the current taxation laws to legally pay no tax or virtually no tax. So what we need is a taxation model where they, as well as other corporations, are forced to pay 1% of turnover directly as tax. Now, if you're concerned about small business being caught up in this new tax, it's very simple. What you can do is you can pass legislation that says any corporation or company that has a turnover of more than $5 million per financial year pays a 1% transaction tax. A 1% tax on everything they earn. Now that tax would raise over $120 billion per year, which is an extra 35% taxation revenue. It would have minimal effect on people in this country, but it would have a maximal effect on these corporations, because the same laws could be passed around the country to ensure that corporations who are able to offset their losses for decades, who are able to use tax havens to minimise their taxes, are forced to pay their tax for using the infrastructure that is created by successive governments to ensure that we have the ability to communicate in this country. To allow Facebook to get away with what it has done is a travesty. Not in terms of a travesty as far as Murdoch and his cronies are concerned, but a travesty as far as the government is concerned. More importantly, the debate. Unfortunately, because the majority of media in this country outside the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which has been hamstrung by a board, which has been handpicked by the current Conservative federal government to minimise dissent. It's the private corporations who are in that battle with Facebook. They're not interested in Facebook paying taxes. They're not interested in a 1% transaction tax because they would be caught up in the same tax. And they use the same tax evasion procedures not to pay tax. Murdoch, the Murdoch Empire, is a classic example of legacy media that doesn't pay tax in this country, although they've been in this country for over 50 years. They don't pay tax. They pay minimal amount of tax, and they do it legally by using loopholes in the taxation laws by putting pressure on the federal government and oppositions to pass legislation to ensure they pay minimal taxation. So this 1% transaction tax would not only affect Facebook and Google, it also affect the legacy media, it would affect the transnational mining corporations, it would affect all the large corporations which now dominate economic activity in this country and around the world. A 1% transaction tax could raise tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to be used for public hospitals, public schools, public infrastructure. That's why one of the fundamental principles of public interest before corporate interests, one of our fundamental principles is a 1% transaction tax on corporations and businesses that have a turnover of more than $2 million per year. That would exclude 90% of businesses. 90% of business, but ensure that those businesses and corporations which dominate economic activity and cultural life in this country pay their fair of tax, so we don't find ourselves in a situation where a country as rich as this, with 25 million people, has over 700,000 children living in poverty. So the decision is up to you. You can do nothing, and that's legitimate, or you can do something. And if you want to do something, I suggest you find political organisations, political parties that are interested in promoting the idea of a 1% transaction tax for businesses and corporations that have a turnover of more than, say, $2 million per year. And public interest before corporate interest is one of those political parties. So I encourage you to go to our website, pibci.net, have a look at our policy platform, and if you're interested in joining a political party that is there to make a difference, well then join. You can download the application form by going to pibci.net, and if you can't use a computer, and I don't know why you're watching this if you're not using a computer, you can always write to us at Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052, or you can leave a message on 0439 395 489. We currently have 443 members on the Australian electoral roll. We need 550 in order to apply for registration as a federal political party. We hope to be able to apply for registration within the next 6 months, so we'll be able to participate in the next federal election at the end of this year or early next year. Ultimately, whether we reach the number or not is up to you.